This is about defending democracy. This is no longer Democrats versus Republicans. What do you want your kids to believe in? There must be give and take.
This is White Flag with Joe Walsh.
Former Congressman Joe Walsh here. So there's a group I recently found and have become a really big fan of. Starts With Us. They're a movement working to overcome the extreme political and cultural division in America. You can find them online at startswith.us. I love them because they're showing people it's possible to have real, meaningful, productive conversations with people you disagree with. I'm a big fan of this. This is what I try to do on my podcast because right now in America, we have two major political parties that are at each other's throats. And the most dangerous aspect of this is that it's led many of us to avoid having hard conversations with people we disagree with. We're afraid to have these hard conversations, afraid to deal with the tough stuff, so we walk away. But to save our democracy, we have to stick around. I mean, if we all walk away from the table, then who the hell is sticking around to figure things out? This is what I so love and admire about the work that Starts With Us is doing. They're sticking around. They are the movement for people like you and me who want to fight the extreme political and cultural division in this country. Because guess what? People like us, we are in the majority. Starts With Us found that 87% of Americans are tired of how politically and culturally divided we are. So yeah, I'm not just a fan, I'm part of the movement too. And if you're listening to me right now, I want you to join the movement as well. Go to startswith.us and get their free newsletter. Sign up for their free newsletter. Get involved. Start there. Startswith.us. Thanks. Hey, former Congressman Joe Walsh with you. This is White Flag with Joe Walsh. Every week I sit down with somebody who doesn't think like me because I just think that's a lot more interesting. And we all need to do a lot more of it. Listen to this wherever you listen to your podcast, Apple, Spotify. Check it out on YouTube. Subscribe to my YouTube channel. It doesn't cost you a thing. White Flag with Joe Walsh. I'm really excited for this conversation because, and Ilana Redstone, I apologize. I came across you recently, and I'm going to lead with a supreme compliment, and then we're going to dig in. I think what you have to tell the American people, what you have to put in front of the American people, your message is hugely important at this moment in time. For the audience, Ilana Redstone is a professor at the University of Illinois. She's also the co-director of the Mill Institute down at the University of Texas. I'm going to ask her about
I just have to correct you. It's the university. It's UATX.
UATX, thank you.
Yes, UATX, thank you.
UATX, the Mill Institute at UATX. They work on the breakdown of conversations when it comes to real contentious issues. I don't know how much, and I'm going to ask her. Ilana is on Twitter these days, but you can follow her on Twitter at IRAKRESH. She's got a Substack called The Certainty Trap. And Ilana, welcome. That's where I want to start. You wrote a piece back in March. I don't remember for who. And I think the piece was entitled, "The Problem on Campuses Isn't Wokeness, It's Certainty." I want to start there. Yeah, subtitle. I want to start there, get into this notion of the certainty trap. What is it?
So the certainty trap is this idea that the way we disagree about, when it comes to contentious issues, the way we, I would say more than just disagree, sort of demonize, judge harshly, and dismiss people who see things differently, it's because of some value, belief, or principle that we're holding on to as certain. And so what I'm describing is, it's not so much a grand theory of everything as just an observation of what is. This is when we judge or condemn an opinion, it always, and I don't like to use words like always, but it comes from something that we're holding on to as certain, because it's literally the thing that sort of greases the wheels that allows us to condemn and dismiss in the first place. And we're not particularly good at, or well practiced at, identifying what that is. And so part of the certainty trap is separating certainty from the trap. So not all certainty, in the book that I've written, The Certainty Trap, which hopefully will be published soon.
Yes.
So in the book, The Certainty Trap, one of the distinctions is between certainty and trap, right? There are lots of things that we can be certain about, like I'm certain this is a pen, right? Where there's no, yes, is there some infinitesimally small probability that someone put, LSD in my oatmeal or I live in the Matrix, yeah, okay, fine. There's an infinitesimally small probability, but there's no, first of all, I'm fine living with that small probability. And second of all, there's no trap because there's no judgment. The trap is in the judgment and the dismissal of people who disagree.
So Ilana, bring this to my world of politics.
Yeah. Oh, it's all politics.
It's all politics. Your example of the pen there.
Yeah.
It is a pen. So when someone comes along and says it's not a pen, how do we handle that? I.e., when someone comes along and says the COVID vaccines did not work. Well, hello. So then how do we handle that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say, so first of all, I guess one thing to say is that I am the questions person more than the answers person. I care about the questions we ask. And so I guess I wanted to close the loop on the certainty trap before I come back to, and I want to write myself a note to come back to this question about the COVID vaccines. To not lose track. But the reason that the certainty trap is more of an observation than a moral argument is because there's two ways out of it. One is to recognize the uncertainty in the world. So that could be when it comes to things about claims that we make that are scientifically based, right? Why does science not give us definitive answers? It could be that kind of thing. What do we know about the relationship between sex and biology? What do we know about the causes of and solutions to inequality? What is the best immigration policy? All of these kinds of questions. So recognizing uncertainty is in the world, that is one way out of this trap. The other way out of it is by being extremely precise in our thinking and our language when it comes to what we're condemning or what we're objecting to in someone else's opinion. So for example, like one of the examples that I use in the book, and I want to come back to your COVID example in a second. One of the examples that I use in the book is, if you take this example from a couple of months back of the Ugandan law against homosexuality, one way, assuming you're, and I use that example because it's something where most people in the West at this point would be aligned on sort of objecting to it. One way to object to it is to say, well, that's barbaric and homophobic, right? And that's one way to do it. But now I'm in a sort of semantic argument about like what it means for something to be barbaric or homophobic. Like if you could imagine that I'm in a room, which I wouldn't happen, but like imagine that I'm in a room with President Museveni, who's, the president of Uganda, and I say, well, that's barbaric and homophobic. And he says, well, I'm not homophobic. I didn't outlaw being homosexual. I outlawed the action, whatever. Right. It doesn't matter. Like it ends up being not a useful way to engage.
Can I interrupt with just one nuanced question that you probably won't answer yet? Because I'd love, and you may want to write this down too. I get that, but what if a thinker in America, in the West, said that?
Said what?
Said that we should ban homosexuality.
It's the same thing. It would be the
same thing.
Yeah. So what I was going to say, the other way to object to that is, I don't think we should criminalize the sexual behavior of two consenting adults, right? Like now I'm being very specific about what it is that I'm objecting to in that law. Right? Like, and my objection is not contingent, and it's not making any assumption about the intentions of the other person. It's based on what principle is it violating for me, and it's precise and clear in a way that's barbaric or that's homophobic gets you, it doesn't have the same clarity, and it makes assumptions that you could argue about whether those are good or bad assumptions, right? Like, could you actually have an anti-homosexuality law that's not homophobic? Okay, fine, you could have that discussion, but that's a different conversation.
So Ilana, focus less on the person who is articulating a certain stance, and focus more on the stance itself.
Focus on the stance itself and make your argument in a way that is precise. And when you commit to that precision and you commit to sort of the precision, the clarity in thinking and expression, you can't make it. Well, maybe that's too strong. It becomes much harder to make an argument that rests on assumptions about someone else's intent. Right? Like condemning someone and saying, well, that's racist, or that person is a libtard, or whatever, or a snowflake, or whatever it is, becomes sort of sloppy thinking. Because it's just not specific enough about what it is that you're objecting to in a way that uses words that the other person that makes sense to the other person as well.
Yeah, you're not going to change anybody's mind doing that.
You're not going to change, right? In the former way, you're not going to change, right? You might, feel virtuous, or you might, I don't know, you might sort of feel good about it, or you might sort of get some response on social media, but you're not going to. But it is somewhat sloppy thinking that when it comes to how we engage with one another on contentious issues, it doesn't get us anywhere, right? It doesn't.
Are we, Ilana, I would argue that we're very divided politically. I would argue that polarization right now is at an all-time high. I'm in that world. We're at each other's throats politically. Does a lot of this have to do with your notion of the certainty trap, that we believe we are right, we can never be wrong, and we don't know how to engage with people who don't think like us?
Yeah, I mean, certainty is basically the thing that underlies moral outrage and righteous indignation, right? And when we are righteously indignant, when we are morally outraged, we're not being clear. And it's not the same thing as saying, one of the criticisms, and I promised I'd come back to your COVID thing.
No.
One of the questions that I'll get a lot in this work is, well, are you saying that all explanations are equally valid? And this does get back to that a little bit, that all explanations are equally valid, or all opinions are, we can't say what's good and bad. That is not at all what I'm saying. What I'm saying, we can and should be clear about what's good and bad, and what policies are good and bad, and what's right and wrong. And doing that only makes sense if we're really clear about what our goals are and what we're trying to optimize for.
Even though we'll disagree on what's good or bad.
Even though we'll disagree, because just to go back to the immigration example for a second, what does the right immigration policy even mean if I am not clear about whether immigration is, for example, supposed to primarily benefit people who are trying to flee worse situations in other countries, or whether it's primarily to benefit people who are already in the host country, the receiving country. Yeah. What does best immigration policy even mean until or unless I'm clear about that? So it's not saying that we can't declare something right or wrong. It's stepping back and saying, well, first we even need to be clear about what that means. What are we even talking about here? When you think about affirmative action, is affirmative action good or bad? I don't know. What are we trying to do? What does it mean? What is the outcome that we're trying to establish? What does success look like? How will we know when we get there? Right? And it gets into all of these other things which we tend to gloss over, and that fuels, I would argue, the political polarization, the conversations that we're not having, the oversimplification, the assumptions about other people's motives, that fuels all the outrage, that underlies political polarization that leads to challenge questions about
Yes.
civil discourse, free speech, fights over critical race theory.
What causes this, Ilana? What causes this? What causes both sides, most of us, to be certain that we're right and they're wrong? Where does this come from?
That's a really good question. I think I don't have a clear answer on it. I mean, I have sort of a bunch of theories.
Yeah.
I think that we avoiding the certainty trap, what I'm calling for, really is going against some of human nature. Like, we just categorize things. We have to categorize the world as it comes towards us. And our tendency to categorize people and situations as good and bad has to be one of the most natural things that we do. Like, I mean, people have written about this for centuries, right? So and I think there are probably reasons that we could talk about why is it worse now, but that need to categorize and to oversimplify and to filter out information, that's not new.
Is this equal opportunity on left and right? Ilana, I come from the right. I'm still of the right, even though I left this Trumpian right. And I think what's unusual, and pick this apart, is that politically today, there's a lot of what my former supporters on the right espouse that just doesn't reckon with the truth. Like, Trump won in 2020. The vaccines didn't work. COVID wasn't real. I can go down the line. And I think it's created on the left this notion that the crazy right, they're not even dealing with basic truths anymore, but they kind of aren't.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the COVID, sorry, there's just a lot. When it comes to the COVID vaccines, one of the things, when you move away from certainty, right? And so another question sometimes I'll get is, well, what am I saying? Am I saying that, we should stop teaching evolution in schools? No, because there's nothing about leaving, and this applies to the vaccines as well, there's nothing about leaving certainty behind that says that all explanations have an equal probability of being true. Right? There's just, so if you think about almost a number line that goes from 0 to 1, right? Where 0 and 1 represent positions of certainty. 0 is never going to happen or never, not, impossible, and 1 is definite, right? You can almost lop those off. And there's a categorical difference. Once you lop those off, there's a categorical difference when you go from 1 to 0.99, then from 0.99 to 0.98. That microspace of doubt, of sort of, I could be wrong, that doesn't mean that whether evolution is true as a theory is suddenly a coin flip. It means, right, it means that now we can have a conversation about what slides us along that spectrum, closer to 0, closer to 1. And when it comes to, and that applies to things like COVID, and this is, and the election, frankly, where do we belong on that? So if you think about the election, for example, one of the things, and I actually been talking to people about this a lot in the last week because I have been trying to get my own head around it. If you think about, there's probably a world. So if you think about election fraud and election denial, there's a world, I'm sure, and I'm not a denier of the 2020 election, but there's a world where I would probably be concerned about an election, right? Like, I can imagine a world, like, let's say, it's not so far-fetched. Like, let's say for the next election or some election, I decide to park my butt, outside of the polling place, and I see the same 15 people go in and out, like, all day long. I'm not saying this would happen, but, like, there are scenarios where I would be like, that seems kind of, that's a little, I'm not sure what's going on there. So the question then becomes, like, now, obviously that's not been my experience. So the question then becomes, like, one of the questions, should I trust the outcome of an election unless or until I have evidence that proves that I shouldn't? Or should I, by default, be skeptical of an election, right? Unless I have evidence that suggests that it's absolutely, that there has been no fraud or no significant fraud, right? Do you default to suspicion, or do you default to trust? And go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, because I come from Trump world, for 5 years, I deal with these people daily. And when somebody says to me, Joe, Trump won in 2020,
yeah,
what I try to do is say, how do you know that? And I try to ask them questions and show me the evidence. And I just slowly try to put little nuggets of facts in front of them. But Ilana, you're not saying, I mean, or is it wrong for me to say this? Trump didn't win in 2020. We're certain of that. Have I just fallen in the trap?
So I am probably a little extreme in how careful I am about language. Like I try to be extremely, I'm sort of obsessed with precision. Do we know for sure? I don't know if we could say, I don't know. Honestly, I don't know if I could say that for sure. I don't believe that Trump won. I don't believe, now when I had a conversation with someone a couple of weeks ago, and I was saying, okay, well, what about the court? And I was trying to understand his perspective because he was skeptical about the outcome. And I said, well, what about, these however many court cases there were that said that, that they were judges who were appointed by Trump, et cetera, like everything that, I'm not pointing out anything new here. And he was like, well, did those, and this is someone who I am friends with. And he was like, well, did those cases demonstrate beyond the shadow of a doubt that there wasn't evidence of fraud, right? Or did they simply conclude that there wasn't sufficient evidence of fraud to draw a conclusion that it was corrupt or that it was fraudulent? And I was like, that's not how I live in the world, but I understand that. I get it. And that to me has to do with a much bigger question about trust in institutions.
Yes, agreed.
Right.
Agreed.
And I think that trust in institutions, I think the certainty trap has had a massive effect. I can't prove this. This is my theory. I think it has had a massive impact on trust in institutions.
So you Ilana, you say that the certainty trap leads us to believe that the people who disagree with us are either idiots or evil. And again, I come from this world. Is it wrong for people on the left to consider a MAGA person on the right who believes the election was stolen? Is it wrong for that person on the left to consider that person on the right an idiot for believing that?
I guess I would phrase it a little bit differently. If you want to do that, what is your goal? Right? What are you trying to do? Are you concerned? I guess what bothers me is, so I understand where that comes from, but then I get a little frustrated if that same person is then going to come to me and complain about political polarization, for example, right? Think about what you're doing and how that's impacting the sort of broader conversation. And so I think that, and I will say that I understand that what I'm saying, what I'm asking people to do is hard. And I get that, and sort of being open. But I guess I would make two other comments. One is when it comes to one example would be conspiracy theories, right? Which you get into a little bit with some of the election stuff. Yeah. How do you want to respond to conspiracy theories? How do we as a society want to So one of the ways that people will sometimes try and respond to conspiracy theories is to point out the logical flaws or the contradictions in the thinking, right? Well, in order for that to be true, this would have to happen and all of these highly improbable things. That rarely works in terms of reaching someone who is convinced. Conspiracy theories are fundamentally...
Ilana, that's like the scientist sitting down with RFK Jr. trying to debate some of his conspiracies. Yeah.
Right. Impossible. Conspiracy theories are fundamentally about certainty, right? Yeah. They are about certainty. And so to the extent that we can model uncertainty in our own language, right? In our own, well, what would, how would I know? I've had this example in the book, in the Certainty Trap book. Let's say that I think, and actually I want to write myself a note to come back to something. This example in the book, let's say I think my neighbor is a Russian spy.
Yeah.
Right? I don't, but she's a lovely person. But let's say I think she's a Russian spy, and I sit down and I talk to her, and I'm like, and maybe she's very generous and she's very willing to humor me in the fact that I think she's a Russian spy. And she says, but Ilana, like I was born, I live in Illinois. I was born in Decatur. Yeah, that's what you're telling me, right? Right? And so then she says, well, I went to, do you want to talk to my kindergarten teacher? Like who was, I went to school in the Decatur elementary school, and yeah, but you just can find someone who can lie for you or whatever. Like, and the fact that you don't have an accent, that's just because, you were really well trained. And she could say, well, here's my birth certificate that says that I was born in Decatur. Yeah, but you know what? Documents can be forged and right. So there's and it's true. Like what I'm saying is true, but what is the likelihood? Again, this default to suspicion and default to trust. How much do I want to sort of grasp onto highly improbable things, even though they are possible? How much do I...
Ilana, what's fascinating about what you're saying, and I love this, and you asked earlier, if somebody looks me in the face and says the election was stolen, Biden won, what should a person on the left or even me do with that? And you said it depends upon what your goal is. And this keeps then driving me to this question, because we're talking about polarization and we got to listen to each other and understand each other. Are there some people, Ilana Redstone, who are just fundamentally unreachable?
Yes.
Like you're not going to find common ground with that person.
Yes, I think so. Okay, so one of the points I wanted to make was that when I said that what I'm asking people to do is hard, and so let me come back to the unreachable thing. But when I said that what I'm asking people to do is hard, all of us have issues, and for some people it might be the 2020 election that we want to take off the table. For others it might be Holocaust denier, whatever, whatever it is. I think at the individual level, it's hard to engage with uncertainty on issues that feel really personal, that feel really sensitive, that feel where we feel the stakes are very high. And so there's always these things we want to take off the table. At an individual level, if I don't want to talk to my Holocaust denier neighbor, whatever, right? That doesn't really matter. As long as what we understand as a collective is that the more issues, the more of us take off the table, the worse off we all are.
Well, stop, but I want to stop you because, by the way, I'm in love with you right now. I find this so damn interesting.
Oh, good.
Ilana, so I want to take a Holocauster denier off the table, not because it's personal to me. I'm not Jewish, because that's fucking insane. The Holocaust happened.
I am Jewish.
If I'm dealing with someone who just will not even acknowledge that, it ain't personal to me, you're gone. That happened.
Yeah, I get that. I mean, I get that. And again, you're talking, but what I'm saying is that if you're going to open the door to uncertainty about the world and what we know, any place that you close it is arbitrary. You can talk about infinitesimally small probabilities, but really when it comes to the world that we occupy and how we understand history, and how we understand the present for that matter, and how we understand each other and other people's motives, we can close the door, right? But it is at some level,
Agreed.
It's always arbitrary.
But are there some things, Ilana, that we should close the door on?
Maybe. I think we could have that conversation. Like I've said, I'm more about questions than answers. I think we could have a conversation about should we close the door on Holocaust deniers? What happens if we should we close the door on acknowledging uncertainty about the Holocaust? I mean, this would be sort of the German model where I don't know if it still is, where it's illegal to deny the Holocaust, right? Should we do that? I don't know, maybe. But I mean, let's have a conversation about what that means and what is sort of what the outcome of that might be and what that looks.
Well, yeah, and I don't want the German model. I don't want it to be illegal for people to think whatever they want to think. We're talking about polarization. I think those are just some people that shouldn't be engaged with.
Yeah, I mean, you're going back to the unreachable thing. So here's what I would say. Hopefully this will resonate with you. Everything that I'm saying really works best if under the assumption that what people care about is understanding what's true about the world, right? Like if what you care about, and I think that's actually a pretty good assumption for many people, but it does break down at certain times. And so one example where it would break down would be, and again, this is more in your world or in your past anyway, if you're talking about politicians, right? So if you're talking about a politician, and I don't mean to be sort of universally critical of politicians, but...
Oh, feel free.
But if you're talking about someone where the incentive is to win an election, right? Your incentive may be to oversimplify things, right? So like, don't vote for the other guy, he's an idiot, or he's a bad person. Vote for me, I'm good. That's an obvious oversimplification. But your incentive is not to be clear about what's true in the world. Your incentive is to win an election, right?
Yes.
Another example where it would break down would be, let's say you have someone who is just interested in controlling the narrative and shooting out a fire hose of lies. Right? Like so that, and what's important here is that they themselves don't believe what it is that they're saying.
Yeah.
Right? Now you're talking about a different set of incentives. So what I'm describing about the certainty trap really works, again, so I think it works very well in educational settings. I think it works well for people who do care about political polarization, people who care about society.
What's the goal, Ilana? What's us overcoming the certainty trap will get us where?
The goal is, well, let me start by answering what the goal isn't. The goal is not agreement. It's not agreement. It has never been agreement. The goal is to understand disagreement in a way that says I don't actually have to demonize and condemn the character of or dismiss someone who disagrees. I mean, not to put too high of a price tag on it, but I mean, this is literally something, democracy cannot survive in the face of certainty. It needs uncertainty.
That's a powerful thing to say.
I mean, not to sort of oversell my case, but like it's that important. And this is not, and to be clear, like this is not, what I'm describing is not, it's not a tool to win an argument. It's not about finding the sort of gotcha moment in your opponent's argument. It's not about debating. This is fundamentally about how do we understand the world and how do we understand each other and what are the costs of getting it wrong?
So then stop. Everything you're saying right now, I love. This is manna from heaven for me. Then Ilana, though, the unreachables.
Yeah.
What do we do with those? Like you can sit down. I can find you a good, genuine, sincere leftist thinker sitting down with a MAGA person, and they can be respectful and listen to each other. But at the end of the day, they're not going to find any common ground with each other, that person.
I don't actually know if so just as like I said, agreement is not the goal.
So common ground may not be the goal.
I don't know if I have to think about that. I don't know if common ground is the goal. Like, I think, in other words, this is why I worry about, I'm a big, I think civil discourse and empathy, these are great and important things. And but here's, I guess, one way to think about it. You could have a room full of people who are committed to the norms of civil discourse. Like, I'm not going to raise my voice. I'm going to take turns speaking. I'm going to reflect back to you what it is that you say. All of the sort of things that we want people to do as active listeners, and have them all still be stuck in the certainty trap, right? Like they're not. So what I'm talking about is a much more fundamental understanding of how we understand the world. I don't know, when it comes to people who are unreachable, yeah, there are people who are unreachable, but I don't know that to sort of make a difference. I'm not sure that this needs to reach everybody. It needs to reach a critical mass.
Exactly. And that's what I thought. That's where I was going to go. But I find this interesting, Ilana, and I think I agree with it. Finding common ground isn't even the goal as well.
I don't think it's a bad thing. Like, I think common ground can be, right, but it's not necessarily the goal. Like, if I say, what would be an example? If I say that I mean, this is another example I use in the book. Like if I use it because it's kind of extreme. But if I say, like, let's say I'm going to have a conversation with somebody who thinks that women shouldn't be allowed to drive, right? Again, one of these examples where you would have widespread agreement in the West anyway. I could say my commitment is really to saying, well, why is it that I think women should have which I do, I think women should be allowed to drive, right? Is it because, so one example might be something like, I think everyone should have equal rights under the law. I think everyone should have the rights that they need to pursue their own potential, to maximize their own potential and sort of flourish as human beings, for example. And let's say that someone who thinks that women shouldn't be allowed to drive, right? Like, what is their thing? And I don't know what it would be. Maybe it's something like, I think that if women are allowed to be independent, this is somehow going to lead to, I'm not endorsing this opinion, but women, it's going to lead to the decay of society in some way. All right, well, what do you mean by decay? Like, what does decay mean? Why will driving lead there? And what will, what are there other things that would lead?
So, it's interesting, Ilana, because of my weird political journey, from Trump supporter to outspoken Trump opponent, the audience for this podcast ranges from far left to far right. And I can hear people on the far left right now screaming at me saying, Joe, would you please ask Ilana, why the hell should I care to understand why someone would think women shouldn't be allowed to drive? Why should I even want to understand that?
You can take
They're
it
screaming at me right now.
Yeah, no. That's fine. And I would say, you don't have to. I would say that can be your thing that you take off the table. Just understand that the more things, the more of us take off the table, the worse off we all are. The other thing that I would say is the reason that this is powerful or has the potential to be powerful, the reason it works is because part of what I'm saying is that when we're precise and we're clear about what our values and our principles and our beliefs and our assumptions and all of that are, that works because it's going hand, I didn't say this before, it's going hand in hand with a commitment to the idea that there are no values, beliefs, principles, etc., that are exempt from questioning or criticism. None. And so it's because there's a symmetry that nothing gets across the political divide and that nothing gets sort of shelved as being put up on a pedestal with a spotlight as, okay, well, we can criticize all these other ideas, but not my pet thing over here. That starts to break things down, right?
Okay. Let me challenge then what you just said, because I find this interesting. And I forget what you said. You said the more things we take off the table, the worse it is for our democracy, our society. I forgot exactly how you put that.
Sure.
I don't know that I agree with that, Ilana, but help me. Shouldn't there be basic things we take off the table? Like we should never bring back slavery. So if there are people advocating that, for the society, we should take that off the table.
Absolutely. And no, this is great. It's because I actually use...
No, you're great. I am having so much fun listening to you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, so the slavery example, I use this as an example. I use this as an FAQ in the book. So the slavery example, the reason this is not an argument that slavery is actually an easy example, because here's slavery, it violates so many core principles that we can articulate that it's easy. So in the sense of all lives have equal moral value. No human being should be enslaved, period. I'm just making these up, right? Like these are principles that it values. We don't have to, committing ourselves to being clear and precise in our values does not mean we have to let them go, right? We do not have to let those go. Now, someone could come in and say to me, it does mean that if I'm going to really walk the walk, someone could come in and say, you know what, I don't think all lives have equal moral value.
Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not really willing to let that one go, but, what does that argument look like?
Right.
I don't have to back down right? So again, so slavery, there's nothing in what I'm saying that says, maybe slavery is fine. No, not in any way, because it's actually very, very clear what those principles are.
Should we then, as a society, take something like that off the table?
What do you, maybe be clear? Can you be clear about what you mean by taking it off the table?
Meaning someone out there espousing the return of slavery, we shouldn't even engage with.
I think there's a version where we could. Right. I think there's a version where we could say, look, like this is the value that we've committed to as a society. We will not entertain any institution that treats lives as though they have, less, that treats certain lives as though they have lower moral value than others. Right. And we just make and you'd have to think about, like, are there, can we be consistent in that? That's probably a pretty core and fundamental principle that we commit to as a society. But that's clear and precise. Like, this is the thing. And here's why we want to. You can still tell me why you think that maybe, if you want to, you could have a discussion with somebody who doesn't think that that's the right principle. I'm not sure. But you don't have to. And we can absolutely commit to it as long as that's what we're clear about.
Okay, so, and I guess what you're saying, Ilana, is there are people in this nation who are unreachable. What we're trying to do is figure out how to better reach a critical mass, because we as a country are doing a shitty job even attempting to get there, because we're not engaging with anybody we disagree with in any constructive manner.
And we're very dismissive. Like, so for example,
yes.
Like I was just writing about, so again, the slavery examples, it's easy because it violates so many principles that it's sort of, it makes it an easy example. Like I was telling you earlier, I was writing this morning about the Jason Aldean video. Yeah. Right. Like, whatever. I'm not a Jason Aldean fan. Like, I watched the video because I was curious and.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second because I remember exactly where you stopped, Ilana. Everybody listening to us needs to know that I asked Ilana before we started where she was politically. And she said, I've always considered myself a woman of the left. I typically vote Democrat.
I've always voted Democrat.
I've always voted Democrat. You know who I am politically. I'm a Tea Party libertarian. What I think is so interesting, Ilana, about this medicine you're trying to deliver to all of us is it's really hard for people on both sides to accept. Continue. But you're not some right-winger putting this out there.
No, I'm not. I certainly don't see myself that way.
You're not.
But like, so the Aldean video, this gets criticized. And I just wrote about it this morning for the Substack. This is something that has been, it's been in the headlines of New York Times, the Washington Post, and all of the sort of usual suspects. I don't have a strong feeling about whether we should condemn, whether the video should be played on CMT or not, or whatever. Like I could listen to lots of different arguments, but I do feel like we need to be clear about what it is that he did wrong. Like what is it that he did wrong? Is it that he made a video that seems to be criticizing Black Lives Matter? Is it that he made a video that is sort of painting with too much of a rose-colored glasses, like what life in a small town? Is it that he uses lyrics that are actually literally threatening? Maybe it's all of these things. But if those are the rule, is it that he picked a site for the video that has this violent and past? If that's the case, like, is it right? Like, is there a statute of limitations on these things? Who decides? Like, can the court, right? Like, we behave as though we have answers to all of these questions that we never bothered asking.
Ilana, that's so spot on. That is a perfect, timely example of all of us falling into the certainty trap. And we are just talking past each other on that issue. Yeah. On that side. We've gone to our separate corners.
Right. And I don't have answers to those questions, but like, for God's sakes, could we at least have the conversation?
That's a wonderful example. In my past, I was more of a culture war warrior, and I would get wound up by some of the culture war issues. And there were times I was divisive on the issue of gender. I've become very woke when it comes to gender, transgender Americans. You had a really interesting Twitter thread a while back where you talked about this issue of transgenderism, how quickly one side is to label everybody, no matter what, as a transphobe. And the other side is so quickly to want to ban any and all kind of gender affirming care.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is this, to me, this, again, like, you follow the thread back on so many of these things, and it is a problem of certainty. Like, it's a problem of a sort of failure to recognize the limitations of what we know. Are there people who object to sort of gender affirming care or the trans community because they think that people, it's sort of gross or icky or whatever? I have no doubt that those people exist. I'm sure they do. Does that then mean that anyone who expresses a concern about gender affirming care is doing so because they're coming from a place of sort of
right,
like hostile resentment and like what we would think of as transphobia? That's less clear to me. Like, and so how do you know? So how do we?
But you acknowledge, Ilana, there are people that do come from that place who are
absolutely
transphobic.
I mean, I think we have to define how we use that, what that term means. But yes, absolutely. Yeah. There's nothing in anything that I'm saying. And I mean, I say this when I work with students as well, because I work with very racially and ethnically diverse groups of students. Yeah. Like, in a lot of what we end up talking about, gender to a certain extent, but a lot of it is around race. There's nothing in what I'm saying that suggests that there aren't deep racists in the world or transphobes or misogynists, or like, there's just nothing. I'm making no claim that these people don't exist, right? What I'm saying is, how do we know who's who and what's what, and what are the costs of getting it wrong?
God, that's perfectly put. Ilana, when it comes to issues of gender and race, young people are typically much more progressive and tolerant than older Americans. How do your students respond to your message? Because you're asking them to not paint with a broad brush, to examine why they think the way they do. Do you get pushback from your students?
No, I mean, every time I get this question and I say no, like, I feel like lightning can strike me down, but, I'm not really, like, mostly because I am really not trying to tell anyone what to think. Like, I don't have answers, but I do believe that I sort of come from a place where I believe that the issues that we care the most about are morally and ethically complex. And if we think that they're simple, it's because we're missing something. And so, right, so like when it comes to issues around gender, for example, or race, I think what I try to be careful of with students, not because I'm trying to be strategic, but because I believe this is right, is, what do we know? Like, what do we know about pronouns and gender identity? What do we know about identity more generally? Is identity, one of the conversations I might have with students, is identity, like, if we think that someone who doesn't want to use someone's preferred pronouns, like, and we immediately condemn that person. Yeah. Did we ever actually have a conversation about what social identity even means? Like, is social identity, did I not get that memo? Like, is social identity something that I as a person, I get to define it however I want and expect the rest of the world to reflect it back to me? Or is it something that is the result of a negotiation that's partly how I see myself and partly how others see me? Did we have that conversation at some point? Like, right. So like, what I'm saying to students is, we act as though we have answers to these questions that we never asked. And at the end of the day, maybe you do think that the person, who doesn't want to use the pronouns is exactly what you think it is, but maybe you're a little less sure than you were when you walked in.
Or we live in a world where some of those people who purposely use the wrong pronouns are jerks and jagoffs and transphobes, and some aren't.
I agree.
Ilana, I'm going to ask you three more final bigger picture questions. Yeah. In everything you're saying, you're not saying that there are not idiots and evil people out there.
So
I love that question.
Yeah, idiots and evil people. So I spend a stupid amount of time thinking about these things. And so idiot.
And Ilana, only the reason I'm asking is because that is the place that the certainty trap takes us. And I've lived in this world for 12 years where I thought the people who disagreed with me were either idiots or Obama was anti-American. He hated America. And this is where most of us are at now.
I know, and I think at the end of it, so idiots is idiots the
probably not the right word.
What was the other hateful? What was the other word that you said?
Evil.
Yes, sorry. Evil is actually a little easier than idiots. Idiots gets into this sort of, what do you mean by idiot? Do you mean like a lack of information? Do you mean, is it actually a measure of intelligence? Yeah. Is it like, so I don't. That's a little bit harder. That's
Fair.
A little bit weirder. Evil. So what would it take to think of someone as evil? So like I've run this question in my head about as far as I think I can take it. And so again, so in the book, one of the things that I talk about is this example of, so I come up with two examples. Well, I didn't come up with them, but I sort of draw off with two examples. One is that the shooter in, what was it? I can't remember the year. In the 1960s, who was at the University of Texas, who shot from the
from the tower,
from the tower, who killed all those people, and then was then killed by a patrol person who shot him. And so then there was, I don't know if you remember, but a couple of days after the autopsy, or a couple of days after the shooting, they looked for a brain tumor. They thought they had found one, but they've initially declared it as being as not being something that was likely to have affected his behavior. And then they did a second autopsy, and then they were like, well, maybe we're not so sure. So let's assume, I don't know the answer to what the actual details were for that particular case, but let's assume that let's assume it did have something to do with his behavior. It wouldn't change the horror of what he did, right? Like it wouldn't change this sort of the absolute horror of what he did, nor had he survived how we would think about whether or not he should be locked up, right? But does it change in some way whether or not we think of him as evil, right? Like, so, or should it? So, or here's the other example, right? Like think about Jack the Ripper, right? Not someone I want to spend a lot of time thinking about. We don't know who he was, but, somebody who was, obviously mutilating women. If we could know beyond the shadow of a doubt that he had a chemical imbalance in his brain that basically predetermined that he was going to live a life of violence, does that make it, again, it doesn't make anything, it doesn't in any way diminish the horror of what he did. Does it make it harder to think of him as evil? Maybe, I don't know. Like I asked a
bad question. What I really should have asked was,
it's an interesting question. Yeah.
Are there people that for whatever reason are unreachable? And you've answered that. There are some people who are.
I think there are. I think who do you think? I think it gets, the devil is in the details. Who's unreachable? Who decides why? What makes them unreachable? Like, is someone unreachable because they voted for Trump in 2016 and 2020? Does that by definition make them unreachable? I think that's right. Like I would hope not. Like, I mean, I know Bret Stephens sort of put this one, says, and when it thinks of, in the context of political polarization in this country, that we're in a marriage for which there's no divorce.
By the way, that was going to be my final point I was going to get to. I wanted to quibble with you about that. So don't go there yet.
Okay.
So rephrase.
Yeah.
The goal of overcoming the certainty trap is what? What is the goal?
The goal
Why overcome it?
The goal is, frankly, it's a little bit, let me tell you a quick story. I was giving a talk a couple of months ago at this point to a group of, I think it was Harvard alumni, and I was talking about the certainty trap. And there was a woman in the group, it was a relatively small group, and there was a woman in the group who had the horrible experience a couple of days earlier of, she had been assaulted on the subway, the New York subway, and she was fine. I mean, she was, I think, traumatized, but she was fine physically, I think. And she was just, this came up in the context of sort of just like the preamble conversation that happened before the discussion. At the end of the talk about the certainty trap, one of the things that she said, and I did not see this coming at all, but one of the things that she said is she was like, I actually feel more relaxed about the whole experience. She was like, because partly it had actually been a woman that had assaulted her on the subway. And she was like, I was able to be a little bit less sure and a little bit more open to what might be going on in this woman's life. And she was like, not only that, but she had been very angry about the slow police response time. And so she was a little bit more willing to think, well, maybe they're not just a bunch of like lazy, bums sitting on their butt. Like she was like, maybe that, who knows, maybe what other factors may have been going on. And it wasn't, and some people might see that as saying, okay, well, she was able to be a little bit more empathetic. But what I'm saying is this is not empathy. Two problems with empathy. One is that empathy never tells us, empathy can't answer the question of which group should you empathize with, right? Like it will never answer that question. And the other piece about empathy is that it comes with all this moral baggage. And what she had found through this conversation about certainty was that it actually lightened her load in terms of just how she understood the world. And so I think that at a personal level, I do think it's a sort of easier way. It's a way of like shedding some of that, all that heaviness that we're sort of moving through the world with. Yes, all of that anger, which sounds a little self-helpy, which makes me a little cringe.
At a societal level.
At a societal level, it's like an exhale, like a reset. A big collective deep breath.
And you really believe, Ilana, that overcoming the certainty trap will go a long, long ways toward helping with the polarization and the divisiveness in this country?
I do. I mean, I think that if this is something that we could get, I think it could transform education. I think it could so take an argument. So for example, about critical race theory and how we discuss race and gender. This is not, when I look at legislative attempts to sort of, in Florida being the classic example, this is fundamentally, it's emerged as a problem of certainty, right? About how we think about race and history. And you cannot solve a problem of certainty with more certainty. Like this makes no sense. You cannot legislate how people think. But there are ways into this that are not even, they're not hard in the sense that they don't require, a $4 billion injection of funding to make, this is just a change that we can all make in how we think and understand the world. It can change education. It can change how we view people in our workplaces, in our communities. I've talked to people in different church. I talked to someone in the Unitarian Church a couple of months ago who was talking about the divisiveness there politically. It can really reshape how we relate to each other in a wide range of contexts.
People listening to us right now, Ilana, what are one or two things they can begin to do?
You can ask yourself.
Get better at this?
Yeah, I mean, you can ask yourself so a lot of what I'm saying is it's similar to ideas around intellectual humility, right? This is but there's a really important difference. The difference is that when we think about intellectual humility, by the time you realize I should be intellectually humble or more curious about this idea, by the time you realize that, you're pretty much halfway there. And so what I'm saying is, no, what you need to be paying attention to is your sense that this person's an idiot, this person's a snowflake, libtard, racist, bigot, whatever. And that's or the answers to this question are easy or the answers are obvious, right? Because when it comes to contentious issues, the things that we care about the most are morally and ethically complex. And so finding that complexity has value even if you don't change your mind. And you can do that in a room by yourself, just thinking, or you can do it by reading from a wide variety of sources, but you can do it just by thinking through. And so I would say, to go back to your question, Joe, what thing they do right now, the one question, if I had to boil it all down to one question that people would ask themselves, what's another possible explanation? for whatever it is that I'm thinking, for why this person has this opinion, or for why this person believes this or does this or whatever. It doesn't mean you have to embrace that explanation, but you have to try to think about, when you're making the judgments, when you're condemning, when you're dismissing, what is another possible explanation other than the one that you've landed on? Because you're talking about human beings and human behavior, and there's really always more than one possible explanation.
I could talk to you for 7.5 hours. We're not. So I'm going to ask you two final questions. You wrote a piece in January of 2022 called The Crisis of Moral Legitimacy. And you said, I think, universities are training students not to see validity in alternative viewpoints.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. I think it's right, and I think this is why I think focusing on. I think you get these caricatures when you talk about campus and campus politics. We know universities are skewed to the left, right? We know, and I'm in a sociology department, so we are to the left within, right? Like, I mean, if you go much further left, you're going to fall off of something. So, but it's not about. The problem is not about, the way to think about it isn't about self-censorship or shout-downs or disinvitations. I mean, those things matter. But you could have a classroom where no one is self-censoring about anything, right? Let's say it's a classroom where they're talking about issues around race or gender or inequality. There might be no self-censorship at all, and there's still a problem simply because of the way the conversation is unfolding and the assumptions, the unspoken assumptions that are being made, and that don't get challenged or questioned. And so I don't think it's part of some big master plan to indoctrinate. Like, I don't see it that way. But I do think that it is a problem that has important downstream consequences. Last question.
Marjorie Taylor Greene a few months ago, infamously called for a national divorce. When I was in Congress 10 years ago, I wrote pieces about this and I talked about it. And I'm very open that I worry that we can't keep this thing together, that we no longer have kind of a common set of beliefs about what it means to be America. So I've been talking about a national divorce for a long, long time. You talked about it and you mentioned your conversation or something Brett Stevens, New York Times, said, in which he said, politics in this country, as you said, is like a marriage for which divorce is not an option.
Yeah,
I fundamentally disagree with that. What's your take on that?
But can you say, like, when you think that divorce is an option for when we're talking about the state of political affairs, like, what does that look like to you? What is a divorce?
Again, looks ugly, complicated, and looks like I don't know how pragmatically it would work out. But if the country is a marriage and the marriage is now doing more harm staying together, divorce always has to be an option. Like I would never render any marriage helpless that they could never get a divorce. So I don't know practically how, Ilana, we'd do it. But I would never want to take that option off the table if that's the best option for our society.
Yeah, I mean, I guess in the spirit of being, in the spirit of sort of any idea is open to questioning and criticism. I mean, I'm open. I guess I don't know. I don't have a clear sense of what that could look like. It sounds to me like some sort of civil war.
No, exactly. Every way you would paint this country breaking up sounds absolutely horrific. Agreed with that. And the point Brett was trying to make is we should never get there. We got to find a way to work together. I get all of that, and I want all of that, and I hope that that's the case. But eventually, and I know it's not two people, it's a country. Two people reach a point where they shake hands. I understand you, but we can't live together anymore.
Yeah, I mean, and I am divorced. I understand what divorce
Me too.
is. Yes, I understand the complexities of
Yeah.
divorce. I am intimately familiar with that. I guess I don't, but it's one thing for my ex-husband and I to split custody of the kids, and I don't, and for him to move, we've split houses and whatever, we split up the vases and whatever. I don't know, when you're talking about a sort of a massive economy and you're talking about resources and you're talking, I just don't see, it's interesting, one of the ways that I think about this question is in terms of, you've talked about culture war issues. All of the certainty trap stuff really speaks to especially those kinds of issues, right?
Yes.
And so there was, I'm not remembering now the name of the author, but there was someone who wrote about, I could find it and send it to you if it's helpful, but who wrote about culture wars, and he was saying not all, what did he say? It was something like not all culture wars lead to a shooting war. These were his words.
Yeah.
But all shooting wars are basically preceded by a culture war. I don't know if that's true, but that's sort of sobering.
Well, and look, you and I are on the same page. The goal of your work, the goal of my work is to not go there.
Yeah.
Is to not go there.
Yeah.
Ilana Redstone is her name. She's a professor at the University of Illinois. She works. Hey, give me a quick 20 seconds on the Mill Institute.
Yeah, so the Mill Institute is an organization where we take this, what we're really trying to do is work in educational spaces, both K through 12 and higher education, work in educational spaces to create a culture where educators and students can unpack these issues together. And so we work a lot. So for example, we're running a teacher campaign, that will start in the fall. We are doing our second annual teacher fellowship, which will start also in the fall. We have lots of stuff going on there.
Ilana also has a Substack called The Certainty Trap. She has a book that will be coming out.
From your lips to God's ears.
It will, called The Certainty Trap.
Yep.
Thank you. Let's continue this. You're wonderful.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for listening. Remember to listen, share, and follow White Flag with Joe Walsh on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and everywhere great podcasts are found. And be sure to leave a 5-star review. This has been White Flag with Joe Walsh.